Welcome back, friends, to the Hobby Barn Basement and the 86 Skyraider build from CY Models and Texas Warbirds. When we left off, we had just finished the wings and the surfaces and the landing gear. As you can see, the plane is together currently. It is finished. So I'm going to walk us around and kind of do the wrap up on this and show everybody what was finalized. I want to do a quick addendum to the second part of the video where I mentioned that the rods were where I had them in order listed as the 90s were the flaps, the elevators, the 85s were the flaps, and the 75s were the ailerons. That is not correct. The 90s are the flap, the 85s are the ailerons, and the 75s, the shortest, are the elevators. I had to play musical rods with with our rods on the surfaces because I discovered that what I thought was correct was wrong. So I hope nobody makes that mistake and that they see this video before they do that. Anyway, moving on. So the tail section builds much the same way that the aileron does. The servo goes in and mounts inside, up underneath, inside the section on both sides. It mounts the same way the flap servo does. You install your linkage, your horns go on the same way, and install it. Now, if I were to add a second addendum, I think in hindsight I would have put 1-inch servo arms on all of these instead of using the stock arms. I got plenty of throw for my purposes, but I think it would have been easier to achieve had I had a longer arm. Whether it was metal or not, I don't think would have been necessary. It would have been easier. So we'll go on from there. Now, the next thing I want to point of note into this is when you install the surfaces onto the fuselage, there is a tab in here, a heavy it's a composite tab that's already part of the fuselage, and it runs both sides. You'll see the hole here, and what you're intended to do is drill through, slide this on, and then you put it's a 25mm screw all the way through there, and I believe it's an M3 if I'm not mistaken, and it's coarse threaded. And then you slide this on, and then that threads up through there. And of course you have your aluminum. There's an aluminum rod that goes all the way through. There's also a pair of carbon rods, but I found they weren't quite as stiff, so I went with the aluminum rod instead of the 2 carbon fiber ones. It's like there was an option. I didn't understand what they were for. Subsequently, I used the aluminum. I felt it was the best one. I want to caveat this with, be sure that this is as tight against the fuselage as it can possibly be when you drill that hole, because otherwise you'll end up with a gap. And once that hole's drilled, there's no coming back. This is what holds that there. There's nothing else. It is plenty tight. It works fine, but otherwise you'll end up with a sizable gap if you don't. So pay attention to that when you do it. Now, moving on, the next part is when you install the rudder. The inside of here, I had to widen these holes slightly. This is a pass-through horn. It goes all the way through onto both sides. I used a thicker 30-minute epoxy and put a little bit of micro balloon in there just to help fill it, but it's solid all the way through. The kit was supplied with, let's see, it was like 16 feet of cable. It had plenty enough of the clevises, the brass parts, the clips, etc. There was one thing that it came with that it had a pair of springs. And after I finished the build, I realized that what the springs were for were actually for the steering surface up under here, and it's a little hard to see, but where the steering arm is in here, those springs were intended to be mounted to the steering arms, and then the cables were intended to be attached to the springs. And the reason is, when the plane sits down and squats, the suspension loosens the cables and the springs take up the tension. That's what it's for. Now, if you don't happen to use them, which I didn't, it makes the steering a little loose, which is here nor there. It works. You'll find that it's you know, like any other tail dragger. You don't want it on the ground any longer than it has to be. So just bear that in mind. You'll have springs. But that was it for the tail section. There was one long, thin, it wasn't quite a 256 rod, that once you slide the rudder section in, that it slid up from the bottom through. I made sure that everything was lightly sanded. I used the silicone oil, greased everything nicely, made sure it worked smoothly, and then I used a little bit of shoe goop once that was in there at the bottom, just to hold it in place so that if I need to get it out, I could get it back out. Moving forward, the cockpit was a very easy fix and finish. This is a Warbird pilot. This is the 1/8 or the 1/6 scale. It's a 12-inch pilot. He looks fantastic. You can't have a Spad without a Warbird pilot. So, as you can see, I semi-scaled the cockpit, which this is very easy to do. The way it's cut, it didn't take much to finish. It turned out very nicely. Now, moving into the fuselage, I went ahead and added a couple of carbon rods as guide wires to help for the rudder, not for the steering. You don't have to, but there are holes in there. It made it super easy to do that. Now, the rest of the stuff you're going to organize whether you do this as a gas or an electric. I do want to turn around and show everybody where I ended up mounting the batteries because of the way things ended up. My battery placement went all the way up against the firewall. There's no way to put them any farther forward than where they are right there. The receiver batteries and the gear batteries ended up over here along the firewall. I had to add approximately 2 pounds to the nose of the plane. This has got a Scorpion 5535 160 kV motor. I had a radial printed from the RC Geek and added to it. I also used the Scorpion 5535 mounting brackets. It all mounted straight to the front of the existing mount under the cowl. It went together very easily. I did have to drill out a few holes in the back for mounting, which you may have noticed in through the firewall. That's just so I have access. The other part, when you're adding your cowl screws, and I'll come back to this, measure very carefully because there are already sets in this to accept the screws. So once the engine was mounted, on the back of this I created 4 plywood mounts that actually fit over the bolts, made sure everything lined up correctly, and then slid it on there and adhered it in place. This is a Abelia 2014 prop. This setup with 160 amp Castle ESC, which actually sits, it's a little difficult to see, it sits up on top of the mount inside, but I added 2 pounds of bar stock in here to CG the plane. Now, I ended up CGing this per factory recommendation. It's about 155 millimeters from the leading edge, which ends up being that panel line right there. Now, it can be as far back as where the spar runs through, which is about 1 inch behind there, which is 185 millimeters. Now, I created a hanging piece to put in here, much like you would get with a Hanger 9 kit or a Black Horse kit. I cut it out of 1/4 inch ply, but this kit needs to be balanced upside down. I balanced it with the gear up and down. Because of the way the gear folds backwards, it significantly changes the CG from when it's up to when it's down. When it's down, it will be significantly nose heavy. When it's up, it will become tail heavy. So you want to bear that in mind when you CG it. So ultimately, my CG, I erred on the side of caution. So when I CG'd it with it up, and the gear were up, it came out at just about that 155 mark. And when they're down, it came out roughly another 10 or 15 millimeters ahead of that. I'm fine with a plane that's a little nose heavy with gear down. A nose heavy plane flies, a tail heavy plane flies once. So with those things being said, folks, there wasn't a whole lot more to this setup. A lot of it's just organizing the guts of the plane. That's going to be up to you as the individual modeler. We all do things differently. Because of the nature of the way the wings attach, I didn't happen to have any clips, so I'm still with the wires. So I have a rat's nest, which I'm sure you saw when I stuck the camera in there to show. Overall, this plane does go together very easily. It just uses a wing nut type setup on the front and the back of the wing. It screws right together. It literally only takes a minute to get each wing on and off. Total all-up weight, when I checked it, was just shy of 30 pounds with batteries for my setup. So that is just about it. If anybody has any questions, please leave them down in the comments section. I hope you enjoyed this build. I'm super excited to get the Maiden over with. Over on the CY Models Facebook page, I have posted tons and tons of pictures from this construction. If anybody needs anything, reach out to me personally, either Facebook message, or you may be able to I might be able to get you some email information through here. Good luck, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of your successful builds and Maidens. Thanks. This is Dave with Hobby Barn Basement. Take care.